All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll introduce myself. My name is Laura Geary. I'm the State Field Coordinator for Audubon Florida. So I work on our climate team and I coordinate grassroots efforts around the state. And here we've got our overall agenda for the evening. I'm just going to start a little bit with an introduction about Audubon Florida and why climate is such a priority for us. We'll do a segment on climate change communications, another segment on advocacy tips, and then we'll talk through some next steps. I'm envisioning that all of this will take about 40 to 45 minutes with some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions as I'm speaking, please feel free to drop those in the chat, and then we'll address them at the end. So why climate? We know that by burning fossil fuels and increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that we've significantly contributed to global climate change. And we know the consequences of that for our communities, for our economies, our health, environment, safety. And we know that it's the #1 threat to birds in North America. The important thing is that we also already have the solutions. And the three that we focus on the most are energy efficiency, green infrastructure, and renewable energy. Because they not only help us mitigate climate change, but they also offer a lot of co-benefits. We have a world with cleaner air and water. We have safer, healthier communities. We save taxpayer dollars. They're job creators, and we protect our natural resources. So the message that we have for advocates and for our allies around the state is that we've got to work together to do the right thing, to create not only a better future, but also a better present for our communities, for our birds, and for Florida. And when we look at the threats to Florida's birds, we see a lot of the same threats that our communities face: flooding and sea level rise, drought, hurricanes, and extreme rainfall, overdevelopment, heat waves. But the good news is that the solutions that work for us are also the solutions that work for birds. So we want to be investing in our natural infrastructure and making sure that we're not only borrowing from nature when it comes to implementing climate solutions, and borrowing in things like creating living shorelines or looking at permeable pavements so that we're reducing flood risks. But we also want to make sure that we're conserving and protecting the natural areas that we have, because they're so important when it comes to sequestering carbon, and also for things like mitigating storm surge and protecting us from increased flooding. At the same time, one of the easiest ways to address climate is to simply use less energy and to invest in energy efficiency. And of course, it's not just about using less energy, but also about changing the kind of energy that we're using and making that transition to a renewable energy future. So when we're advocating for climate solutions, one of the things that we want to think about clearly is our communication strategy. And we have some science-based tips for effective climate communications. There's been a lot of research around this over the past couple of years. And so everything that I'm sharing with you, I've taken from research from studies pretty much from 2014 to 2020-ish. And I just want to start with the term climate change. There are so many different ways to talk about climate change without necessarily even using the word climate change. And you'll see here, I've got a list of some of the terms, and it's divided by that orange line. The division is for this reason. There are some folks who feel that the urgency of our situation necessitates language that matches that urgency. Things like climate crisis, climate emergency, and climate catastrophe. And those words are really, really galvanizing for some groups. But research also shows that they're alienating for other groups. So when you're talking to folks about climate, make sure that you're gauging how they might be able to respond. And you want to choose the language that gets you the best success for solutions and that injects a little bit of hope in people. So if you're looking at climate communications and you're even looking at the way that local governments talk about climate, sometimes you'll see changing climate or global warming. People will even talk about changing weather patterns or focusing on some of the impacts of climate, like extreme weather events and flooding. Folks who are particularly attuned to the biodiversity issues that we're having might respond to climate-driven extinction. But the main takeaway is that there's a whole host of ways to talk about climate change, and that you just want to choose the way that resonates most with the audience that you're speaking to. One thing also that we want to do is that we want to emphasize consensus. So research shows that highlighting norms can lead to greater scientific acceptance and support for public action. And that could just be highlighting the fact that, yes, 97% of climate scientists think that global warming is significantly due to human activity. Or highlighting other types of group norms. There was a study that showed that people who knew about their neighbor's energy consumption adjusted their own energy consumption to meet that of their neighbors. So they would lower their energy consumption if they saw that their neighbors were using less energy, so that they were sort of meeting the norm of their community. So if we promote norms about science and we promote norms about behaviors, then people do adjust. And one of the neat tools to look at this is the Yale program on climate communications runs nationwide studies every year that they break down by county and by congressional district. And they look at public opinion estimates. So this is one from 2020. I highlighted Bay County. And you'll see that 69% of folks believe that yes, global warming is happening, but there's not a lot of consensus around the fact that most scientists think global warming is happening. Even though we know that 97% of scientists do, only about 49% of people think that that's true. So having those conversations can be helpful in changing those public perceptions. The really, really good news, though, is that regardless of people's beliefs about the causes of climate change, there is a lot of support for climate solutions. And there is some research out there that shows that regardless of people's beliefs about the causes of climate change, there's still a lot of hope in engaging those kinds of groups around solutions without necessarily even talking about the causes. Believing in the causes of climate change is not always a predictor for policy support. So again, this is from Bay County. 83% of folks said that they support funding research into renewable energy sources. There's also a lot of support for tax rebates for energy efficient vehicles and solar panels. And a whole host of people think that schools should be teaching about global warming. So these are norms that we want to be sharing and promoting as well, the fact that there is a consensus around solutions. If you're interested in seeing the climate opinions for your own county, you can go to this link, and I'll be sending this out afterwards in the email that I send out after the presentation as well, if you're interested. In addition to highlighting norms, one of the things to do is also to rethink the messengers that we use to talk about climate change. And part of that is taking climate communications out of the future and into the present, because research shows that people are actually pretty bad at assessing risks, and they discount long-range threats. And a lot of times the scientific communication about climate change is about projections. But we can look to things that are happening right now in our communities, in our economy, that show that climate solutions are not only the future, but they're also the present. They're the world that we live in. And Ford is actually a great example of this. In their strategic plan, they say very clearly, the risks and opportunities associated with the changing climate are shaping the way we do business. Shaped by this belief, we aspire to become the world's most trusted company designing smart vehicles for a smart world. And it's not just language that's in their strategic plan. If you look at the rollout of vehicles that they're planning for the next couple of years, they're increasingly investing in hybrids, in electric vehicles. So it's not only the threat of climate change that is motivating people to act on climate, it's also just the fact that this is the world that we live in, and we've got new technologies and we're innovating our way into, again, a world in which, yes, we're producing fewer carbon emissions, but we're also just evolving and adapting and changing the way that we do things. So We don't always need to talk about the long-term risks of climate change. Sometimes we can just talk about the things that people are already doing. And again, this helps to set those group norms. Another thing that research shows us is that when dealing with conflicting information, people tend to use their emotional and experiential processing systems. So there's been a movement in climate communications research to see what happens if we ask people to tell stories that might be able to trigger some connection to climate change. And in Florida, it's not hard to find stories that connect us to climate, right? If we look at the newspapers, we see stories about heat, we see stories about flooding, we see stories about public health, and particularly we see stories about extreme weather events and storms and the devastation from hurricanes, particularly in the Panhandle. So when folks are given the opportunity to connect those experiences to information about climate, it's helpful to kick those experiential processing systems into gear. And the last thing is that it's really important how we frame these messages. So studies have shown that people really need two things to get on board with climate solutions. The first is that they need to know that the solutions will work. So there needs to be a clear explanation of how this solution will produce an effect. And those are the logical arguments that we need to support our advocacy with. But the second is a little bit more human. People need to be able to see how the solution includes them. They need to be able to see how this touches their life. They need to be able to see how they fit into it. And so whenever we're framing messages about climate solutions, there's kind of a multi-step process that I think about. One is just starting with the solutions themselves. So taking the three that I talked about at the beginning: energy efficiency, natural infrastructure, and renewable energy. And then identifying the short-term gains, because again, we want to take communication out of the future and into the present. We want people to be able to see how this benefits their lives immediately. So with energy efficiency, you have lower energy bills. When we protect our natural infrastructure, we have reduced storm surge and reduced flood risks. When we switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, we have cleaner air and water. Besides identifying the short-term gains, we want to address kitchen table issues. Some psychologists who were working on climate change communications pioneered this idea of the finite pool of worry. Basically, that folks only have so much room in their minds to worry about things. And so when you've got people who are worrying about jobs and taking care of aging parents and taking care of kids and putting food on the table and paying the rent, it's really hard for climate change to have a space in that finite pool of worry. But the truth is that climate touches all of these aspects of our lives. So we need to be able to connect those dots. That when we're talking about energy efficiency, we're also talking about affordable living. That when we're talking about protecting natural infrastructure, we're also talking about keeping people safe in their homes and protecting the investments that people have made in their homes. And that when we're talking about switching to renewables and that clean air and water, we're also talking about healthy families and public health and, you know, kids not riding school buses and inhaling diesel fumes. So making sure to connect all of those dots, and also just being aware of the fact that people do have these finite pools of worry, right? And being very empathetic and understanding of that in our communication. And then the last part, which is the part that it's so easy to forget, particularly when we're communicating with elected officials. And we feel the need and the urgency to make the economic arguments, to make the strategic arguments for climate solutions. is that we still want to activate intrinsic motivation. And this is especially true if we're talking to other advocates or folks that we want to get on board. People have value systems, and they do want to feel like the work that they're doing is honoring those values. So when we talk about energy efficiency, yes, it's about lower bills. But ultimately, it's about protecting families and communities and protecting hardworking people. When we talk about natural climate solutions and we talk about conserving and protecting habitat, our mangroves, our seagrasses, our forests, our upland habitat, yes, these natural systems sequester carbon dioxide, and it's important to preserve them for those reasons so that that carbon doesn't get released back into the atmosphere. But also it's because we want to preserve the beauty and purity of the natural world. And when we talk about renewable energy, yes, we have cleaner air and water, and yes, it's important for public health. But the other thing too is that it gives people an opportunity to choose where their energy comes from and to not be dependent on foreign oil sources. So that's also a value that folks have, the ability to choose that for themselves. And if there are going to be two takeaways from climate communications research, it would be these two things. Give climate change and climate solutions presence, and give people hope. So we give climate change and climate solutions presence by bringing the conversation out of the future and into the present, talking about things that are already happening now, by sharing stories and encouraging other people to share their own stories, so those experiential processing systems are engaged, and by illustrating norms and emphasizing the consensus again, so norming the idea of climate solutions. But two is equally important, and people have to have hope. If the doom and gloom was sufficiently motivating, we would be in a much different place than we are right now. So it's not to say that people shouldn't know about the severity of climate threats, but also that they need to be able to see a path forward. So sharing local solutions and illustrating people's roles in achieving them, showing how those climate solutions address everyday problems, those kitchen table issues, the things that keep people up at night, and inspiring people to support their values. And from there, we're going to transition into a conversation about what this looks like at the local level, right? I've talked about the importance of folks being able to see local solutions, to see what's happening around them and in their communities. And what I want to talk through is a way that you can look at your own city, your own county, and get your finger on the pulse of what's happening in terms of climate solutions or resilience, and help people see that there is movement happening, or look at the gaps and see where movement should be happening. So this is a kind of checklist that I go through in my mind whenever I'm working in a new city or a new county and looking to assess the work that's been done around climate. And it has a really unwieldy name. I've kind of named it my Climate Resilient Sustainability Green Checklist, and that's because every city and every county has a different name for this kind of work. So the first thing that I do is I just look at the office or department, like where does this work live? If somebody is working on flood mitigation, if somebody is working on energy efficiency, if somebody is working on emergency preparedness, is there a house for that? And in some cities and counties, there is a separate office of resilience or a separate office of sustainability, but in other places there's not. So I'm going to use the example of Pensacola, which is how I filled this in. Looking at the city of Pensacola, there's no separate office just for climate and resilience and sustainability, but that work is being done somewhere else. So for example, Mark Jackson, who's their sustainability coordinator, works under Public Works and Facilities. And I kind of just beat myself to the next one, but the next thing is I look to see, is there a figurehead for this work? A chief officer or a coordinator? And again, in Pensacola, Mark Jackson was hired and he's their sustainability coordinator. There may not be a single person who's working on climate issues, it may be spread out among a couple of people. So sometimes it takes a little bit of digging to see who's got this as part of their roles. And again, it might be a public works person, it might be an emergency management person, it might be a natural resources person. So I go onto the department websites and start doing a little digging. The next thing I like to look at is there already a countywide, a regional plan, a citywide plan for addressing climate? In 2018, a Pensacola task force published their climate action recommendations. And some cities and counties will have these very specific plans. For others, the climate solutions are tucked into other plans. So don't be concerned if there isn't a specific plan just yet. And then I'll also look to see, have there been at any point in time, or is there currently a committee or a task force that's organized around this work? Pensacola did convene a climate mitigation and adaptation task force that has now sunset in order to produce those climate change recommendations. I know that they're still working with different local groups to provide updates on those recommendations and the things that need to be implemented. So if you do happen to be from Pensacola, you can be on the lookout for that. The last one was in December. And lastly, I'll look to see if there's been a greenhouse gas inventory. So a greenhouse gas inventory can either be a municipal operations inventory, and that's when cities and counties look at their own emissions. So looking at their buildings and seeing how many emissions are we producing through our energy and water use, what kinds of emissions are we producing through our own fleet, or even just folks commuting to work. Or they can be community-wide within the geographical boundary of the city or the county. And then that includes private homes and businesses as well. And this is a good baseline, right? So when cities and counties have that greenhouse gas inventory done and they know the emissions that are being produced, it helps to prioritize emissions reduction strategies. And again, when I looked at Pensacola, they did complete a greenhouse gas inventory with ICLEI, which is an organization that helps local governments with sustainability and resilience work. And the last update that I got was that they're working on refining that data. So when you go to your own city or your own county, this is the checklist of things to kind of start with to see where that work is being done and where opportunities for advocacy are. And like I said, sometimes it's very straightforward, sometimes it's not. So don't be discouraged if there isn't that office or that isn't that, that person. For example, when I was poking around, I saw that in Walton County's 2020 update to their local mitigation strategy, their emergency management plan, this was where a lot of the information about climate change and climate threats was, looking at different flood and drought and storm risks. So sometimes this information can be found in other places and it won't necessarily be the climate action report. And here are some of the things to look for. I stole this from Miami's climate action plan, which was launched last year, in fall of last year. And I just took this section from it because I think it really neatly outlines the kinds of things that we can be looking for in our own municipalities. One, like I said, is that plan or that set of recommendations. Two is seeing if there's any legislation that's up for a vote. Three is looking to see if there are programs or projects that are being funded in terms of resilience. And then four is really looking to see, has the city or the county done any work to revise their own operating procedures, their own protocols? And I want to dig into the local legislation piece just a little bit. Some of you may be experts on this. If you are, I salute you. Because tracking local legislation can be a bear. And if you're new to it, it can be tough to figure out what's happening. At the federal level and at the state level, it's actually quite easy to see how bills are moving through Congress and the Senate. There are websites that you can look at, very neatly tells you. At the local level, we are not so lucky, but this is a list of things that I do. So The first two is creating relationships with the council members or commissioners on the boards who are invested in these issues, and also reaching out to staff. So that's why it really helps to do that legwork and to find out, is there a point person or are there some point people who are working in this area, finding out who they are, getting in touch with them, and getting updates on proposed legislation, because they'll know before the public does. The other thing is to follow local advocacy groups. I basically use Facebook and Instagram as my own climate and environmental and conservation newspaper. And I follow all of the groups, I subscribe to their newsletters, and I get a lot of good information about ordinances and resolutions that are going to be up for a vote that way. You can also dig into the agendas for upcoming county commission meetings or city council meetings. This is a bit tough because they do have to be publicly released before the meeting, but sometimes they're only shared a couple of days beforehand. You'll find them on the county or the city websites. But again, sometimes they're only shared a couple of days beforehand, so you might not get a lot of notice about a vote that's coming up, but still worth it just to scan through them. And then one of the things that I do just to keep a broad reach on things that are happening in the region is to set up a Google News alert for the issue. If you've got a Google account, you can go in and set some terms. So for example, one of mine is just climate change and Florida. And I have it set so that I get alerts every afternoon, but you can have it set to once a week. So basically every time that there's a news article that has the term climate change and Florida, Google saves it for me. And then in the afternoon, I get a list of those news articles. And I've got a bunch of search terms that I've got in my Google News alerts, but that way I don't have to be constantly scanning the papers. It all comes to me in an email. And again, going to this piece of tracking local legislation, if you are looking through those agendas, if you are getting word that there's going to be something up for a vote at the county or the city level, it's good to distinguish between the ordinances and the resolutions. And again, this may be old hat for some of you, but I still like to go over it. So an ordinance is an official legislative action of a governing body. It's an enforceable local law. So if a county, let's say, is passing an ordinance, thinking of a recent example, let's say that for public construction, for parking lots, 10% of the spaces have to be devoted to EV charging stations, or they have to be wired so that EV charging stations can be put in later. Then that's legally enforceable. That becomes part of the city code. And commissioners or council members will vote and decide whether or not that becomes part of the code. But the other things that can be voted on are resolutions. And those are expressions, those are declarations. So you might be familiar with some of the resolutions around the state with different cities committing to 100% renewable energy by a certain date. And these are good as public declarations of things that the city or the county wants to aspire to, but they're not legally enforceable, so they don't have teeth. So just something to keep in mind. Resolutions and ordinances both have their benefits, but in order to change code, in order to change law, it has to be an ordinance that's being voted on. And this is just a summary of that. Ordinances are laws, resolutions are declarations, ordinances are legally enforceable, resolutions are not. Importantly, though, both ordinances and resolutions can be introduced by, among others, different committees within the city or the county, individual council members, but you too can also go to your council member and ask them to sponsor a resolution or an ordinance, and they can introduce it to the council or the commission. And then if it's sponsored, it'll be placed on a meeting agenda and it'll be read in public where people have the opportunity to comment on it before it's voted on. Ordinance have to have 2 public hearings, so 1 first reading, and then it'll be set for a vote at a second meeting. So there's opportunity for public comment at both meetings. and also opportunity to communicate with decision makers in between. And the last thing to focus on when it comes to figuring out where your city or county is in the climate and resilience landscape is looking at the budget process. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about the budget right here, although we are planning a separate webinar and a separate training about the municipal budget process for folks who are interested. But it is a really good place to look to see where the money is being spent. And where the money is being spent is generally where the priorities are. So for municipalities, the fiscal year runs from October to September. So every September, a budget is voted on. It's approved by the county commission or the city council. And then that becomes the budget that's adopted starting in October for the following year. Before that budget is adopted, every year there have to be public hearings around the budget, and those generally happen in September. So there's 2 public hearings. Before the public hearings, the budget is released to the public. You have the opportunity to look through it, and you have the opportunity to speak to the council or the commission and talk to things that you think should be in the budget that are not, or things that are in the budget and maybe shouldn't be. And though those meetings happen in September, the budget process really starts a whole lot earlier, because the draft budget is usually done in about July. And so from October to July, there's an internal budget process where all of the departments are making their own budget requests. They're saying, I need money for this position. I need money for this program. I need money for XYZ. And then the Office of Budget or the Office of Finance is balancing the budget and making sure that the revenue matches the expenditures. So all of the past year's budgets are available online. You can go in and you can look at that, and you can see what's being funded, if anything resilience-wise has been funded. And again, as we move forward through the budget process this year, we are going to be organizing a separate training around that if that's something that you're interested in. So what are next steps? I've gone over climate communications, a bit of an introduction into local climate advocacy, and now I've got an ask for you, which is to go look at your city, to go look at your county, and to see the work that is happening or is not happening, and to see if there are places where we can help you catalyze that work. And it doesn't have to be a big region-wide initiative. Those little projects, those resolutions, those ordinances, those budget asks, those are the things that when you amass them all together, roll up into big change. So I'm going to be sending a follow-up email that's going to include some of the information from this, and is also going to include the request that you share what you find with us. And you share your questions with us, you share your information with us. And if you happen to be in a place like the city of Pensacola that already has that climate action plan put together, we can sit down and talk about what are the next steps in making sure that those recommendations get funded, or what are the next steps in making those recommendations part of the city code. How do we get those ordinances on the table? If you're in a different place and you're looking at the budget and you're looking at some resilience projects that have been funded, that's a good place to sit down and have the conversation about how do we get more of these projects funded? How do we get public input on the projects that are happening? So I thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited about continuing this conversation. I'm going to share my contact information, although again, I'll share it in the email that I'm going to be sending out afterwards.